I would like to bring us to the next wonderful speaker, Maktuno. Now, I'm not a Jungian psychologist, but I'm a big fan of synchronicities. And whenever I start organizing an event, just when I'm thinking who to invite for speakers, Maktuno tends to drop me a line. It was the same a year ago when he spoke at our personality festival, and the same now. Just a month ago, I was thinking, who to invite? And Maktuno drops me a line saying, let's have a chat. And I was like, well, destiny calls. So I'm very happy to introduce Maktuno, who has fantastic experience to share. And it's very rare that you get somebody who is a therapist working in transformation space. So I could not pass up on this opportunity. So without further ado, Maktuno, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nikita, so much. Yeah, we always seem to catch up, and then I share with him some of my musings about life, the world, the cosmos, all those sorts of things. So today what I wanted to really talk about was, it was kind of less about COVID-19 and the anxiety around, for example, the ambiguity caused by it, or the amount of stress because people are facing real physical health concerns out there in the world. I kind of wanted to talk about, what does it look like when our organizations have moved to working almost wholly in a digital way? So it feels like over the past decade, we've talked about the digital workplace. We've had, digital collaboration tools. We've got, cloud computing. We've got ways of sharing information across different offices or different sites. But what does it actually mean when during lockdown, all of us started connecting with our organizations as entities purely through digital touch points? That's what I want to talk about, because I suppose some of my emerging thinking is that I think it's really revolutionized the way our cultures are working. And so I want to share some of my observations that I've seen in my current role. So just a bit about me. My background is as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. So I started my career working in criminal justice systems and looking to innovate approaches to treating severe personality disorders. Then sort of by happenstance, I ended up coaching a CEO of a large mining company, and quickly realized that the same levels of psychopathy can be found in the working world as well as the criminal justice system. And that started a journey really for me into consulting, into looking at the people and talent space within a business context. And then more recently, I moved more into thinking about how do you drive large scale organizational change and transformation. So I currently work as the Global Transformation Director for Iris Worldwide, which is a global advertising marketing agency. And my job there really is to kind of set the agenda for the business around who are we going to be in a couple of years' time, and what are the changes that we need to make to get there, working with the exec board there. So that's a bit of kind of my background. I suppose I bring lots of different perspectives to the table. So even at the moment, I work in a transformation role, but at the same time, I still have a private practice of therapy clients that I see on a Saturday. So I have this really curious dynamic where I see things happening in an organization, and I'm responsible for looking at change in the organization. And there's a lot around cultural change within my remit. And at the same time, I find myself in these one-to-one settings where I'm talking to people and seeing some of the impacts in that setting as well. So I've got that kind of macro perspective that I hope to bring to the table today. If I go back a bit, I've always been fascinated by what happens to our behavior in a digital ecosystem or digital spaces. So increasingly now, we don't necessarily relate to people through physical space, but we relate to people through these digital touch points, whether it's hearing a voice on a phone, or sending a message, or using social media to connect with friends or family. I put these three images here because I wanted just to share a couple of quick stories about things I've seen happen to people when they start to relate to people mostly in a digital space. The picture on the left, if no one recognizes this, is from Second Life. And Second Life is a game where you create an avatar, where in a sense you can actually live out a second life. And I had a patient, actually, interestingly, I ended with quite recently, who had a whole digital identity built in this game. So she related mostly to people through this game. She would run charity conventions in a world she'd created on this game. All her friends came from this game. So she very much had a digital identity, and she connected to people in digital communities. They weren't close to her in physical space, but there were people around the world that she connected with and she spoke to on a daily basis as she interacted on these games. So I became really fascinated by this notion of, this was a really extreme version of someone who literally built a world online and an identity and everything that she did really went through this kind of digital medium. The next thing I've got here is just some eyes. As a therapist, I've found that I just don't have eye contact with my clients anymore. So I went from seeing people face to face to suddenly, like we are now, kind of being able to pick up on emotions or cues, but finding that I wasn't physically connected to people in space, and noticing that my identity and my clients' identities were shifting, morphing, changing, that they will present differently in a digital space compared to a physical one, and that there were differences in communication. The third picture I have here is around a text message. And just to give some context to this, probably about 10 years ago, I had a client who had borderline personality disorder. And essentially that's characterized by impulsivity. And one of the challenges that this person had was that when they had an argument, they would impulsively send a message to the person and break off relationships very, very quickly. And it suddenly again got me thinking about, wow, there's something about operating in digital space that means the rules are different. And I want to kind of suggest that there has been a revolution in the way organizations are functioning because of the wholly digital nature of many of our interactions. So I was having a conversation with our chief people officer, I think it's on this call today. And I was just saying that we've not actually connected with each other except via Microsoft Teams or video for the past 4 or 5 months. But yet we've got this digital relationship. Does that look the same as face-to-face? I would suggest actually it's quite different. But a revolution is where something happens. It's a sudden radical change. Something happens in our world that shifts everyone into a different way of being, a different way of working. I think that there are some big shifts in organizational dynamics I want to talk about today. As I've said previously, the digital workplace has been emerging, but fundamentally we were still largely tied to physical space and face-to-face interactions. Whether it was people and businesses who were in client-facing interactions, clients would still demand face-to-face contact. People still prefer to have kind of boots on the ground. So if I was collaborating with the US, for example, we have businesses over there. Before COVID, the suggestion was you go out there, get boots on the ground because digital is not quite good enough. This has radically changed in terms of the way we operate. So something shifted. COVID meant that we became wholly digital organizations. And I'm talking about overnight. So many of you would have experienced this. Suddenly, you're just not connected to physical space. You're disembodied. We're kind of all these digital entities that kind of float around on Wi-Fi and connect over different channels. Something really fundamental was shifted. We saw people start using digital platforms en masse to communicate. Now, we always had these digital platforms and tools, but many people didn't use them. Some people still relied on walking over to someone in the office or flying over to a particular office to collaborate with somebody, or just people were very reliant on email. So I think we've all been there before COVID, maybe even during COVID, some people are still the same. But endless email chat and streams where you're just going through email backwards and forwards with one-word answers. A lot of this has changed. People are now communicating on these digital platforms en masse. This is a huge shift. Companies were set up before to try and drive digital adoption of some of these platforms. COVID happened, suddenly everyone was using it. The second thing, I mean, I love this picture. We've all seen it, this video of the toddler kind of running in on this father trying to conduct a serious interview. The boundaries between home and office and personal and professional become massively blurred. I can talk from personal experience. If you look at the image that's shown of me that looks, very professional with a blazer on and a white shirt, I'm now conducting most of my calls in a t-shirt, especially on a hot day like this. But there is something about the personal and professional that's been blurred. Colleagues have met my wife because that she's been in the room, and I said, I'll meet my wife. Never would have happened previously. I've talked to our CEO with a baby on his lap on a talk about business transformation. These are really, really significant shifts that are happening. This was happening already. The lines were becoming blurred, but when we went wholly digital, suddenly my space, the room I'm in, my home becomes my office. People ask me about the books on my shelf. I can't necessarily wear a mask or a disguise to work because actually things about my home and the space I'm in will reveal that. I think we've all seen people start off during COVID looking very, very professional on calls, and slowly the standards have slipped and slipped and slipped. Towards now, we're just all largely kind of dressing as we'd want to dress. There have been unparalleled levels of digital collaboration internally and externally. So like with the previous call with, so the previous session with Stuart, conducting some of that digital collaboration on the annotate feature on Zoom. In our business, we've used Miro. We've run these digital workshops with our clients. These are unparalleled levels of digital collaboration. This would not happen prior to COVID. It's a real shift in terms of the ways that people work and shifts in expectations. Office culture and etiquette have almost disappeared overnight. So who can relate to lots of coffee catch-ups at work? Who can relate to that awkward moment where you try and book a meeting room and you have one tiny 30-minute slot, and you have that kind of standoff at the window with someone inside who's still trying to carry on their meeting? All of these office behaviors and practices and customs, they're no longer as prevalent because simply we don't have them. So there are new cultures and customs emerging. I saw this really interesting, it was an image that showed kind of archetypal Zoom characters. So, you know, the Zoom character who has a cat that crosses the screen, or the Zoom character who always, I don't know, who someone walks in awkwardly to the screenshot. There are new ways and customs and thinking that we're having about what work etiquette actually means. And also people coming into the workforce who don't understand any of that etiquette and haven't been socialized within an office environment, if that makes sense. Everyone becomes accessible across hierarchical or geographic boundaries. I found this particularly powerful. So because my role is global and I'm often trying to connect with the US and with APAC, I find that it's as easy to talk to someone in London as it is to talk to someone in the US or over in Asia. So we're finding, again, unparalleled levels of collaboration across different boundaries. Businesses have capabilities in different countries, and suddenly you can access them, or you can unlock synergies simply because now we've got the digital collaboration tools and ways of working that support that. Internal comms get supercharged. I've seen this happen. Leaders are sending out videos. People are sending out emails more regularly because, again, the only touch points we have that connect us with the entity of the organization are digital. So a communication, an email, a video become our only touch points because we're not in physical space. And this was a really interesting moment I just wanted to touch on, and I'll talk a bit about it later because I think we have to see this through a digital lens. There is something about the fact that because we are all digitally connected, because we're consuming more content, because we're all online, it means that cultural moments affect a larger proportion of people, and we're all taken on a journey when things happen in the world. So I think there's something about us all being connected and being online, which means that cultural moments happening outside the business, in inverted commas, hit the business and start to drive change in a faster way. So I think we saw some of this during Black Lives Matter, which I don't think would have traveled as fast if we weren't all online and if we weren't all connected to these cultural moments through seeing certain visuals or seeing certain commentary on certain issues. So this revolution has happened in our organizations, and it's accelerating. We're suddenly working in these digital ecosystems. Now, I alluded to this earlier. How do people behave when they are in a digital ecosystem? So let me touch on a few things. There is something about people when they're in a digital ecosystem where they're empowered with a greater voice. Now, I think the best way of thinking about this would be, if you think about the way that brands or companies connect with consumers, once the notion of a digital marketplace emerged where we could buy online and be customers online, you suddenly found that customers could just call out something that a brand or company did. I think we're seeing the same things within businesses. I think we're seeing now that because we're digitally connected, we can, through one message or something on our social media, call out challenges or things that are happening within our organizations. There's something about us being digital and being digitally connected where we have channels to express our voices, which means that when we become wholly digital organizations, as we have been, people are empowered, people speak out, people express things, people have channels where they can communicate themselves powerfully. The second thing is about digital communities. So again, in the same way that if you think about our digital lives, we can now connect with people from a particular demographic or segment of society. I think that now you find in businesses that people can find like-minded individuals and connect with them across digital channels. So I'll give you an example. It could be in a business, there's a diversity task force in a certain region. There is nothing now stopping a person in another region from being involved with that and finding solidarity around diversity and inclusion initiatives or issues, where previously, because they were physically distant, they wouldn't have had that digital community. So there's a sense of empowerment, solidarity, people coming together because of these digital channels. We have digital identities. I touched upon this earlier. Now, there's a sense in which people are creating content. Leaders are starting to create videos. Leaders are starting to think about what's my messaging, my communication across different channels. Digital identities are emerging in ways that previously wouldn't have happened. Again, in digital ecosystems, we expect access to more information. If you think about the shifts because of the World Wide Web, because of access to information now, there is something about the fact that I expect to know more. So in the same way that in our organizations now, because we have ways of sharing information across different geographies or different markets, I want to have information, I want to understand things. It's a changed expectation that our employees start to have. If we move to the lower row, we're more open and transparent. So if you think about what are the values that are prized within a digital ecosystem or digital space, people champion transparency, share information, be authentic, be real. If you think about the fact that we all have profiles on social media where we share our lives, where we share photos of ourselves, where people can understand what our shoe sizes are all the way through to the new job that we've got. Transparency and openness are prized within these ecosystems. So the expectations around leadership style or how people behave shifts. I alluded to this earlier. We act faster and more impulsively. I'll look at some examples in a minute just to kind of reiterate this. But there's something about when I can just click something, just send a message, send a GIF on a digital channel, which means I act more impulsively. So behaviors start to change. The last two, we become very visual. So for example, right now, the only way I really have of connecting with my organization is through a slide deck or through the people that I engage with on Zoom. I don't have a physical space where I can breathe in and absorb aspects of the culture that go beyond just visual stimuli. It becomes quite limited to certain sort of sensory areas. And finally, we consume more content. Because we're all online, there's a sense in which now we want more content, we want more engagement, because we want to somehow be connected with these digital entities that we belong to and work for. So you can see there are some really interesting ways that digitally working affects our behavior at a fundamental level. I'll move to the next slide. I think we can take some leaps from, if you think about where this has happened already, I've said this previously, digital marketplaces and brands have had to really shift around how they relate to customers. So if you think about the fact that because digital transformation has occurred for lots of businesses and they now have a digital kind of service or product offering, you're finding that there's been a shift from customer service that's static and it's about frontline staff to this notion of customer centricity. So this idea that actually the brand relates to a consumer across physical and digital space in this joined up way. I think what's happening is we're playing catch up a bit, but I think that in workplaces, as we become wholly digital, there's a parallel process occurring where there's changing employee behavior and expectations. So we are also having to think about what does it mean to join up an experience for our employees across physical and digital space. And there's something about how do we adapt to respond to these new behaviors and new expectations? Because there are some interesting phenomena that are being thrown up, I'm finding from my experience in digital spaces that just don't happen in physical ones. A few lockdown observations. So again, this is very emergent thinking, but it would be interesting to see if this resonates with anybody. So new ways of working. People work extremely flexibly in different hours of the day and or weekend. So in our business, we've introduced the concept of kind of core hours, but what's really interesting is that people seem to communicate, again, these personal professional lines, people seem to communicate much more freely across them. So it's no longer this kind of 9 to 5, 9 to 6 way of working. And again, I think there are negative aspects of this connected to burnout and those sorts of things, but it's interesting how these lines are very, very blurred. People are much more casual and less professional. They're more open about their lives and in communication. So I think of myself recently, I'm chatting to somebody on Microsoft Teams And as I'm talking to them, I am much more chatty in terms of how I talk. I noticed that I'm using the GIF function on Microsoft Teams to crack a joke. I noticed that my attire has become more casual. I noticed that my hierarchical relationships within the business, that people, for example, far more junior in the business, are much more flat in terms of their interactions because they have access to me in a way that doesn't mean they have to literally walk across physical space. So there's something hierarchical that shifted, which means things are flatter in terms of the dynamics. The third thing, people communicate across lots of different channels in different ways. So now there are lots of different channels we can communicate with each other through, and each channel has different rules and different meanings. So for example, I might communicate with someone differently on Zoom, to Teams, to email, to Slack. If Office has a WhatsApp group, there'll be a different way I communicate on there. So you can see this is much more complex in terms of the types of communication, the types of channels that exist within a digital ecosystem compared to one that's that's more physical. More content and connections. I want to share here some really interesting things that I've been reflecting on because they're things that we've done during COVID-19 as a business, but I haven't quite figured out yet whether it's us responding to, or on one level, it's us responding to the challenges of operating a business during this time. But I wonder if unconsciously we've also started to understand that there's something different because people are in digital space, if that makes sense. So town halls and video messages from leaders every week. More details, more information. I've noticed this. We're doing it more. Are we doing that more because people are scared during COVID, or are we doing that more because we're working digitally and there's something about the dynamics of behavior in digital space that people demand more information? I don't know, it's a question. We created a learning and development platform where people started to share their skills and experiences. There was a platform called Fast Forward where people would share some of their insights or their learnings. So we kind of created almost like a internal Netflix, and then all of the sessions are recorded and go onto Vimeo, and it becomes almost like a Netflix on demand site. This is really, really interesting because if you think about it, again, operating in a digital ecosystem, the business is becoming a content creator. And there's a demand for better quality content because it's the only touch point that employees have with the business. We created an internal radio station for employees where on Microsoft Teams, someone would do a DJ set and people would tune in. And then we created our own version of Desert Island Discs where people started to interview people in the business to understand and connect with people. These are real shifts in culture that reflect potentially just having, the digital tools and enablers to conduct these sorts of initiatives. But at the same time, there's something different about the way people are craving for points of connection. And finally, I've talked about this, the creation of channels for lots of different groups to connect on. So noticing across my Microsoft Teams, lots of different groups and segments of our organization where people are connecting around different issues. Some of that's connected to external work, some of that's internal. Now, I want to talk a little bit about our response to Black Lives Matter as a business, because what I think is really interesting is that there is something about the fact we were in a digital ecosystem that kind of drove a sequence of events around how we responded. And again, this is just some of my reflections, taking a step back and reflecting on our response to it. So what was really interesting was when Black Lives Matter happened, because we've had these two big things, COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, these huge events in our organizational world. We received a really impulsive email from a staff member saying, what are you going to do about this? And there were a couple of things that struck me. Firstly, I was like, wow, this is really, really bold. This is a really impulsive email. And afterwards, the person actually even said to me, I said, thank you, because you actually triggered something and you triggered a response from the business. But there was something so impulsive about it, which again, this is why I've got these two icons. There was something about people's voices being heard because we were existing in a digital ecosystem, wholly digital ecosystem. Also something about a higher level of impulsivity that someone just fired off this email that set something in motion. So we received this email. We then decided to say, look, we're not going to just put out a message to say that we are anti-racist. We want to actually look in the mirror ourselves. So we organized these listening groups where Black people in our organization shared their experiences. And I put here 98% attendance. We almost had 100% attendance. In what world, before COVID and before being digitally connected, could you literally join up everyone in a business over a Zoom call and actually share a cultural moment where you listen to the experiences of Black employees and how they've been affected by Black Lives Matter. This wouldn't have happened because you'd have to find a room big enough, you couldn't find it. At the second time, not everyone was connected around this cultural moment, but everyone was affected by George Floyd because we're all connected, we were all online, our world shrunk because we're all connecting through screens. So there was something about being able to, people were interested in turning up for these things, but also we were able to do it. And there's something here, I put the transparency icon about behavior in digital space. There was something important about us leaning into the reality of people's experiences in our business. Because again, in a digital ecosystem, transparency becomes a really fundamental value that people start to think about. It became really, really important that we didn't just respond superficially. I think that there is something connected to us being in digital space that drives the elevation of transparency as a value. The third thing is we mobilise task forces to tackle issues across geographies. So there was something about our ability to suddenly say, who wants to get involved? Who's interested in activating a strategy that we're developing around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Get involved. Previously, you'd be trying to find rooms. It would be very hard to mobilise a task force across different geographies if you weren't there in person. But suddenly we could connect these digital communities, these energized groups who are passionate about these things and could help us activate a strategy in the business. This was enabled through us being in a digital ecosystem where behaviours are different. Fourthly, we disseminated surveys and organised sessions to understand issues in more detail. So again, there's something about polling, surveys, crowdsourcing. These are very digital behaviours that people get involved in digital ecosystems. Everyone's voice can be heard. So in the same way on this call, when Nikita takes us to that, I've forgotten the name of the site, but we're all able, even though there's 100 people of us on a call, we're all able to give an opinion because we're digitally connected. So what was really interesting was if I looked at running comparable surveys in other organizations, you had a much lower click-through rate to participation. I think because now we're in a different type of digital ecosystem where people want to share their opinion, they're digitally connected. Therefore, our hit rate in terms of participation was just higher than running it in previous organizations and seeing what the results are. And finally, we launched, we're in the process of launching our strategy on an all-staff Zoom call across 3 regions. Now, again, I mean, in a previous world, is everyone really interested in understanding what a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy is? Would it be launched across the whole business? Probably not. It'll probably be something that's communicated to leaders. It'll be very hard to find spaces and forums to really drive to drive momentum around an issue like this. It might become a policy that certain key stakeholders are involved in. But now we're able to involve everyone, where everyone understands what the strategy is, what we're doing, how we're going to activate it, and can be involved in those task forces. So hopefully this just gives you a flavor. And again, this was me stepping back. There is something going on here. We're being enabled and there's an invisible digital hand almost pushing us in certain directions and shaping people's behaviors in different ways. And I want to look at this phrase here. I think organizations now have the challenge of becoming people powered in the same way that brands operating in a digital marketplace had to become customer centric and had to be thinking about the customer experience. I think that what's happening is as we become wholly digital organizations, we have to become people powered and respond to the changing expectations and behaviors of people in a digital space. So I'm going to come into land here and just talk about what do I think are 3 ways that we can actually respond to people's changing expectations and behaviors within a digital space that we find ourselves in. So firstly, if we think about how in a digital space down the bottom, those icons, there is more value on transparency. People tend to be much faster, more agile. They respond more impulsively within those environments. And also the fact that in a digital space, we have digital identities. There is a big onus on leadership to start to really championing different types of attributes. So I think in a digital space, leaders have to be authentic, transparent, and accessible in profound ways that they wouldn't have previously because the digital space demands it. It's in the same way that we've seen political leaders or celebrities now share their lives. There's something about how I think leaders are having to start sharing more than just, the day-to-day kind of very hard business related aspects of their role. I think there's something about leaders needing to respond much faster in their communications. So I've noticed that people expect responses far faster. I think it's gone from almost a day to being almost, an hour, if not instantaneous, because these digital channels and platforms enable us to do that. So if I literally send you a message on Teams, if you don't answer me in an hour, it's confusing. So the pace is so much faster for leaders. I think there's something about leaders being human and empathic and non-hierarchical, because your people can access you across geography, across hierarchy. Leaders just have to be a bit more humble. They just have to be more accessible, more empathic, more relatable. And also leaders have to be comfortable creating a digital presence. So what does a leader's digital presence look like? What are the words they use, the way they communicate, the videos that they take of themselves to communicate, I don't know, business priorities or strategic priorities to people? So in essence, transparency, empathy, authenticity, they become prized and a developmental focus in leaders. I think things have naturally been shifting this way. I just think that now the digital ecosystem has just highlighted and accentuated them even more. 2 more points. Companies need to create engaging internal comms and digital experiences. If the only way that our employees and people can connect with the business is through digital space, who is intentionally driving a strategy around the employee experience and thinking about all the touch points that they have in their life cycle? So from onboarding through to emails from the business, through to opportunities to engage. I think employee experience and internal comms has been elevated to a level far higher than before, because before physical space and locations were places that anchored people in organizational culture. But now it's purely through these touch points that I'm able to get a sense of the company. So interesting, in our company, there was actually an individual whose role shifted more in this direction. And as I was writing this, I was thinking, that's really interesting, because was the shift to it, I think, in terms of this person's role moving towards being more about looking at employee experience and internal comms, I think it's because we're in a digital ecosystem where someone has to own that and think about that. Because it's no longer good enough to receive haphazard emails that are scattered across our inbox from different people at different points. We have to join it up and create that consistent employee experience. Last point, companies needing to be more inclusive in decision-making culture. So often we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion from the perspective of involving marginalized groups and creating space for them and allowing them to fully participate in our organizations. I think there's a high level aspect of diversity, which is fundamentally about how do we get lots of different types of people, different thinking, different perspectives. How do we involve lots of people in decision making? So I wanted to talk to you about inclusivity on that level. What does it mean for us as a business and in decision making spaces to involve as many people as possible? I think if you look at the bottom, those icons in terms of people wanting to have a voice and people being able to mobilize in digital communities across geographies, markets, boundaries, there is something about how people need to now have their voice heard, because their voice can be expressed and there are channels through which they can communicate that. So I think that the shift towards inclusive decision-making, the shift towards inclusive strategy, the shift towards it not just being a top-down dynamic where senior stakeholders or people design something and just in a monologic way communicate it and transmit it to the business, I think that will change even further in the digital ecosystem, where now as an employee, there's no reason why I can't give a view, be involved, find a way to be involved in crafting the future of our organization. I think at the same time, because there's a higher expectation that we will be not just our professional selves and leave a bit of ourselves at the door, there is something about how being fully authentic and an organization where I can be myself and wear a t-shirt rather than the blazer is expected now. So I, as an employee, you need to embrace all aspects of me, whether it's, I don't know, my social demographic background, or whether it's the things I'm interested in, or I think the expectations have changed because we're in this digital ecosystem. So developing forums, spaces to capture employee opinion and create a culture where people feel accepted and included, I think has really become paramount in terms of how we operate. I've come into land. I realized as I was going on, I was getting more and more passionate because it's an area that I've just become really interested in just in terms of how it's changed behaviors and how as businesses and organizations, we can really respond to these shifts. And I think that there are downsides to the digital connection, like, you know, the burnout, the going beyond working hours. But there are some really interesting things about organizations becoming people powered, where inclusive decision-making, prizing and elevating the employee experience, leaders who are more empathic, authentic and relatable. I think some of these shifts are really positive, and potentially in the future, we can take the best of what it's been like working in a wholly digital organization and combine that in a hybrid form with the benefits of the physical face-to-face interactions. That's me coming into land.
And what a wonderful landing that is. So not only do we know about the books, the aforementioned blazer, but also the preference of your soft drink choices, Maktuno. So I know something about you that I didn't know before. Thank you so much for such a wonderful and beautiful conversation. We started out with Second Life and integrating this digital and real world together. And one of the key things that I take away from this conversation is the need to update of who we think we are, you know, as individual companies, collectives, teams, because we need an update of actually what it means to be an individual, a worker, an employee, a member of the team, or a leader. So thank you so much for that, Maktuno. And I'm just really curious to hear other people's thoughts and reflections. So if we can head over to Menti, 9151-7, and then we can actually jot down some of the reflections. Right, so here we have Menti. And if you can just jot down some of your thoughts from Maktuno's talk. And in the meantime, Maktuno, are you happy for people to connect with you on LinkedIn?
Oh yeah, happily. I'm always, I mean, some people on the call might know, I mean, I think there's some people I connect with on the call. Drop me a message. I'm always interested to think about some of these things and what they look like in your organizations or individually or anything. I suppose, I know Nikita always talks about personality. I'm high in inquisitiveness, as you probably would have realized. So any conversations about anything, I'm interested in.
Yes, we both score high on that. That's why we have the conversations which you mentioned about cosmos and everything to do with philosophy and psychology. So wonderful reflection, the sense of urgency. Absolutely, the time is now. So significant. Those topics which we were discussing are very significant, and the time to discuss them is now. Great insight on how to promote diversity digitally. I'm just curious, Maktuno, what's standing out for you from the takeaways that you're seeing on the screen?
The activation, someone said about activating a strategy through a digital ecosystem. So from a transformational perspective, I mean, anybody that's worked in change management will understand the hardest things to bring people with you on the journey. And what I'm finding is that the digital ecosystem does provide channels for us to think about how we get people involved. So I came off a call today thinking about an internal website where people can actually see what's happening around transformation, the changes that are occurring, updates on information across different areas. Where are we at? Where have we transitioned to? So that's something that in my day job, I'm really always thinking about, is how do we bring people on the journey? So I think that's an interesting part. I just think this has the opportunity to fundamentally, I think sometimes this conversation is a lot around remote working. I think that it can fundamentally shift the way we, for example, design business strategy and create inclusive approaches where we get insights from people who are on the front line close to the ground, because they can communicate with the top table through digital channels, for example. I'm just thinking about those sorts of things.
Excellent. And it was just beautiful how you use this moment of transitions to do something so significant with the Black Lives Matter movement.
I think transgression of hierarchical boundaries is another interesting thing that's coming through from these comments, which I think is really, I just think it's fascinating. I think it was becoming flat. I think digital working has literally flattened it in certain areas. So at times I have to almost remember on a call where someone sort of sits in the organization, because I might think, okay, who do I share what and with whom and at what point? it becomes quite difficult because you're always on a screen with someone, just connecting with them as human beings, which is wonderful. But at the same time, sometimes you're trying to understand what's the right conversation I have to have and with whom, which can be a challenge.
Excellent. Perfect. And we're perfectly on time, which is also wonderful. So thank you once again, Maktuno, for such wonderful, interesting talk, which covered probably more facets than I could have imagined a single talk can cover. So that's impressive in itself. So thank you so much for that once again. And by all means, feel free to connect with Maktuno, start those conversations and keep this conversation going.